Hello, I'm Brian Ruhe. Welcome to the Brian Ruhe Show. Today is October the 28th, 2015. My guest on the show today is Mark Weber. He's the director of the Institute for Historic Review. He's been the director over the past 20 years. Just read a bit of Mark's bio here. He says, Mark Weber is an historian, lecturer, current affairs analyst, and author, born and raised in Portland, Oregon. He was educated in the US and Europe. He holds a master's degree in modern European history from Indiana University. Just a bit of a background on the Institute of Historic Review. Their website you can read below here on the YouTube video. It's called IHR.org. And the Institute for Historic Review is an independent educational research and publishing center that works to promote peace, understanding, and justice through greater public awareness of the past and especially socially, politically relevant aspects of 20th century history. So they strive in particular to increase understanding of the causes, nature, and consequences of war and conflict. They vigorously defend freedom of speech and freedom of historical inquiry through books, booklets, leaflets, audio and video discs, and YouTube videos, broadcast interviews, meetings, conferences, mailings, websites, and email. They strive to provide factual information and sound perspective on U.S. foreign policy, World War II, the Israel-Palestine conflict, Middle East history, and the Jewish Zionist role in the cultural and political life, the Holocaust Remembrance Campaign, war propaganda, and much more. So Mark, it's an honor to have you on my show for the first time. I've known about you for years. I've listened to you on YouTube, and I get your emails every day from the IHR, and I encourage my viewers to sign up on the email list for IHR. So Mark, today you wanted to talk about the current immigration crisis in Europe. So I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for having me on. It's a pleasure. We've been in communication for quite a while. We've talked on the phone, but now after some glitches, we're finally able to arrange this video conference, and I'm very pleased to be with you. I admire and am pleased about your activism also in British Columbia. And in fact, it's a very encouraging thing that all around the world and here in North America and across Europe, there's more and more of this kind of independent activism, which is, of course, very encouraging. Everybody that is activist this way and does things and so forth makes it all the more encouraging, more easier for other people to do that. Today, I wanted to talk about the migration issue because it's been so much in the news, and because to understand what's going on, it's important to understand the background to the crisis we see today. I mean, this flood of immigrants that's coming into Europe right now is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening on the basis and as a result of policies and of perspectives and ideology that's been in place for many, many years. And this is very, very important. In fact, the current flood of immigrants right now is in the news a great deal, not because it's qualitatively different, but because it's quantitatively different. I mean, it's a very big flood that's taking place, but a drip, drip, steady influx like this has been going on for quite a few years now. Anyone who has been to Europe over the last 20, 30, 40 years, of course, has noticed a very drastic change in the demography and the cultural life and so forth of Europe in all over European cities. In our lifetime, London has become now a majority non-English city, non-British city. It's absolutely astonishing. There's large parts of France now and urban areas in France that are overwhelmingly North African. There's a very large section of Berlin that is now Turkish and so forth. So that the current migration crisis that everybody's aware of is only qualitatively more dramatic and different, but the basic trend that's going on in Europe has been going on for some time, because in addition to the flood of migrants from outside of Europe, there's also been, of course, over the last 40, 50 years, a severe, drastic decline in the birth rate among Europeans. And all that are signs, really, of the death of a society, the death of a civilization, the death of a culture. Now, with regard to the migration going on in Europe today, the point I stress very, very strongly is this is only the logical, predictable consequence of years of an ideology and of policies in place, and above all, a worldview that's been in place, which has already made it possible for this kind of suicidal, mad policy even to happen.
Yes.
In effect, Europe has, not in effect, for many years now, the European Union has officially defined itself and defined Europe, not in ethnic terms or cultural terms or racial terms or religious terms, but Europe, the European Union defines itself only as a so-called community of values, a community of ideology. This is madness, because then Europe is nothing more than a geographical entity. It has no real substantive historical continuity. And the madness of this, to define a country in ideological terms or define a civilization in ideological terms, is to make a complete break with history. It means, for example, that a country that also is liberal democratic in its political and ideology is closer to Europe than Europe has been throughout its history. Queen Elizabeth and the Elizabethan age that gave us Shakespeare wasn't a liberal democratic society by any means whatsoever. It was a very religiously narrow society, but it's certainly part of European heritage and European history, and Shakespeare is part of that heritage. But he was not a politically correct egalitarian writer and so forth. But this is typical. But once a society defines itself in this way and says that the ideal of a society is multiculturalism and the happiness of the individual is the most important thing, then welcoming and permitting this massive influx is a logical extension of that. If diversity is a strength, then every society, to be so supposedly strong, is logically going to welcome as many diverse people from outside of its culture as possible. One thing that's really striking to me is, once again, the tremendous hypocrisy of the politically correct left in the United States and Europe. And one of the examples of how our perception of history changes is the discussion in the United States in recent years over the place of Columbus Day. Columbus Day was just a few weeks ago. And in many cities around the United States, and in especially on university, college campuses and so forth, Columbus Day is considered very, very bad. And it's been replaced in many places by what they call Indigenous Peoples Day. In Canada, I guess they call them First Nations, is the politically correct term in Canada.
In the United States, I didn't know that.
Well, but the idea is that the integrity and the character of these so-called indigenous peoples in North America is a very important thing, and it's a great tragedy for the world and for humanity and for justice that the indigenous peoples of North America have been swept aside by the flood of Europeans. But the same people who think that preserving and defending the identity and the integrity of Navajo Indians or Mohawk Indians or Eskimos or Laplanders or Tibetans do not believe that same principle of preserving integrity and character applies to the indigenous peoples of Europe. The Danes are the indigenous people of Denmark. The Swedes are the indigenous people of Sweden. And they are being swept away, to the detriment, of course, of a loss of humanity, by having a people done away with, all in the name of diversity. In fact, the very same people who are very activist for preserving exotic species of birds or fish don't seem to think it's any kind of tragedy that the particular peoples and groups in Europe are being swept away as well. But this is typical of the kind of double standard that exists in our society. You'll find it very popular in Hollywood, for example, that people will talk about defending the integrity of Tibet. And it's a sad thing if Chinese move into Tibet. Well, they're both Asians, they're both East Asians, but the same people think, in contrast, that it's fine to welcome people from the Middle East or North Africa or East Asia into Denmark and Sweden and so forth. This is typical of the confused thinking that prevails in our society and the lack of standards. Above all, I put a big stress on this notion that a society like the United States or like Europe today that believes the most important thing is the happiness and the pleasure and the rights of the individual is a society that's incapable of defending its character as a culture, as an ethnos, as a people, as a heritage, and so forth. This is really at the root of this. And even more than that, I put a huge stress on the fact that this ideology that prevails now in Europe is an ideology that was imposed on Europe at the end of the Second World War by the Allied powers.
Yes, very significant.
1945 represents the first time in history that Europe was under the control of outer European states and societies, or marginally outside. The United States and the Soviet Union completely dominated Europe. They defeated the Germany and its allies during the Second World War, and didn't just defeat them politically or militarily, but also impose the ideology of their societies as well. And especially since the end of the Soviet Union, the dominant, prevailing, in fact, official ideology of Europe, or Western Europe anyway, is the individualistic, egalitarian, liberal democratic ideology that is the ideology of the United States. Now, in that way, we can see that the Americanization of Europe means ultimately the death of Europe, except as a geographical concept. And that's where things are moving. And I put a big stress on this because to understand what's happening means to understand that this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening as the logical, predictable result of an ideology that's been in place for many, many years. And we're seeing the consequences of this now. In fact, Europe today faces a crisis far worse than military defeat or a major flood or earthquakes or even a massive plague like the Black Death that scoured Europe during the Middle Ages. The thing now is really an absolutely fatal and mortal threat to Europe. It means the end of Europe. And we're all supposed to, in the United States, just as we're supposed to welcome the third worldization, you could say, of the United States in this country, so also Europeans are told that they should welcome and embrace their own demise, their own death, and so forth that's happening in that country. Now, even in addition to all of that, there's a great deal of just silly talk in Europe about how the immigration from the Middle East or North Africa and South Africa and so forth is going to enrich the European societies. But the idea that people who are unable to have a very ordered and prosperous society in their own countries are going to somehow contribute to a stable, prosperous, well-ordered, well-organized society in Europe is madness, really.
It's good question. How are they going to do that? Good question.
Crazy. And I mean, well, because the basic reality is that different peoples make different kinds of societies. A society like Denmark is made by Danes, people who are Denmark. It doesn't happen because they have a nice climate or because the flag is nice looking or because of some reason like that. The character of the society of Scandinavia is a reflection of the fact that it's populated by Scandinavians. And the future of Europe, there cannot be a future of Europe unless there are Europeans to make that happen. And if any people ought to be aware of that, it's North Americans. We've seen, for example, how large parts of the United States have been transformed very radically over time and are on their way to being transformed even more as the population is displaced. Detroit is not the city it was 50 years ago. And the main reason, the essential reason, is the population is different. This is all obvious to anybody.
You talked about how Los Angeles has changed more than Poland in the time that you've lived there in the last 45 years, you described it.
Right. I mean, here in Southern California has been more drastically transformed than Poland or Hungary or Romania was under 50 years of Soviet occupation and rule. After 50 years, the Soviets left, but Hungary still was Hungarian. Poland was still Polish because they didn't change transform the population of those countries, and they could go back to being what they were. But the change that's taking place now in Europe means a fundamental, drastic, and inalterable transformation of the society.
It's so fundamental immigration because it changes the demographic of the people. Once they're there, then what do you do?
Right. Then it's a drastic change. And we've seen this throughout history. I mean, obviously, Manhattan is a very different place today than it was when the Indians were there and so forth. I mean, all this is so obvious. But we live in a society that suppresses any realistic sense about history and drawing obvious lessons from the great forces that have always prevailed throughout history. You know, in the country that is, I was just in Sweden earlier this year, and one of the things that's very interesting about Sweden is how, as a society, Sweden has decided to be the most liberal, the most egalitarian country in the world. Sweden likes to say, or Swedes like to say, that the country may not be the number one economic power. It's certainly not any kind of military power, but it likes to take pride in being a supposed moral superpower. And their idea of morality is to embrace policies which mean the destruction and the eradication of the very things that make Sweden Swedish.
Yeah, so it's suicidal.
It's suicidal. You know, and there was a very good article which we posted on our website, which we distributed, by a woman writing in the Globe and Mail, which is probably the most prestigious daily newspaper in Canada.
Yeah.
And it was entitled Sweden's Ugly Immigration Problem. And this woman pointed out in this article, she said, Sweden's generous immigration policies are essential to the image of a country that, like Canada, prides itself as a moral superpower. In other words, what Sweden is doing is in keeping with its image of itself, with its ideological outlook, its worldview. Sweden takes in more refugees per capita than any other European country. And the immigrants, mainly from the Middle East and Africa, now make up about 16% of the population. And of course, the trend is very, very obvious. And she asked, well, how things are actually working out. Is this really enriching Sweden? Is Sweden a better society as a result? And she points out that the majority of people charged with murder, rape, and robbery are either first or second generation immigrants. In other words, the people that make up 16% of the population represent over half of those who are charged with murder, rape, and robbery. To put it another way, 40,
there you go, real statistics.
She also points out 42% of long-term unemployed are immigrants. 58% of welfare payments go to immigrants. 45% of the children with the low test scores are immigrants. Now, this is all, these facts ought to make people pause and change their policies, but that's the power of ideology. People will continue to do things even when they contradict what we realize, contradict reality, because people will continue to do them because they think it's the right thing to do, even when it's contrary to common sense, contrary to of reality. And that's an enormous problem. And it's a reason why I put a great stress on checking premises about society and the importance of ideology, the importance of getting things right from the beginning. Because if the premises and the outlook and the worldview, the ideology is wrong, then everything will go bad as a result of that. Because trying to make what's happening in America and Europe today are politicians trying to make reality to conform to the worldview, instead of making a worldview and an ideology that's in conformity with reality, in conformity with the reality of history and the world. Our politicians try just the contrary, to make the reality somehow fit the worldview. This is madness. This is really crazy. And in fact, it's a kind of a definition of an insane person who lives in a world of their own or in a reality of their own. But
Yes.
This is what's happening in Europe today. Now, as you know, Brian, we talked about this earlier. I've been talking about this and writing about this for some time, and it's just a coincidence that I gave a talk on this very subject earlier this year in Stockholm that was extraordinarily timely, because shortly after that talk was given, this headline-making flood of migrants now from Syria and so forth started pouring into Europe. Of
Actually,
course,
I'd like to recommend your talk for our YouTube audience. It's from April 18th, 2015. It's called Looking Ahead in an Age of Darkness. You can look that up.
right, thank you. Yeah, the text of that is on our website. There's also an audio recording of that talk on our website, and a video is on YouTube of that talk as well. And yeah, I mean, in a sense, what I did is lay out the basic problem, but of course, when I was giving the talk, it was not tied in because it happened before this latest flood of people. You know, a secondary aspect of all this, I think that's worth emphasizing, is that the current flood of immigrants from Syria and so forth is a consequence, an indirect consequence, of the lunacy of the United States policy in the Middle East over the last 10 and 15 years. Specifically, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 shattered the structures of Iraq, and then the U.S. policy also in Syria has so disrupted life that understandably large numbers of people are fleeing to where life is going to be better and more more agreeable than it is in their own country.
Yeah.
But this is, again, I try to stress this, that this madness, this making of policy without regard to reality, but instead on the basis of wishful thinking, is not only true in our immigration policy or educational policy, it's very true in our foreign policy. That our political leaders, when they went into Iraq in 2003, made big flamboyant promises about how they were going to bring democracy and women's rights and so forth to Iraq. Or when the United States invaded Afghanistan, people like Hillary Clinton talked in their chirpy way about how they were going to bring women's rights to Afghanistan. Again, with the lunatic idea that they're going to transform societies and make them over in their image about how a society should be, and not making policy on the basis of the reality that exists in those countries and around the world.
It's ideology versus reality. The ideology is coming from the top down. Ideologies fed to them.
Well, yeah, I'm having trouble hearing you, Brian, and I don't understand why. Yes, this is.
I'll just adjust my mic here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you. It just was breaking up a minute. You know, another aspect of this too, again, and I touched on it earlier, is the central importance of the Second World War in this way.
Yeah, just about
that.
The
Second World War was a great watershed, a very important landmark in the history of Europe and the history of the West. And again, it's more and more obvious to me, and I think to many other people, that the result of the Second World War was a catastrophe for Europe and for Western civilization.
Yes.
And it's important to understand the time. The leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union, the Allied countries, proclaimed that what the kind of world that they wanted was going to be a one world order. The American President Roosevelt and the American leaders seriously claimed that after the end of the Second World War, the world would be ruled, as it were, by a United Nations that would be a continuation of the wartime alliance of the United States and the Soviet Union, along with Britain and some other countries too. Well, this was, of course, another fantasy, another ludicrous idea, because the United States and the Soviet Union were rivals, and very quickly this rivalry manifest itself after the end of the Second World War, because the unity that they had during the war was only a negative one to destroy Germany, really. It wasn't an alliance really based on anything really solid for the future.
Yeah, I mean, think of the communists in the Soviet Union and all these Christians in Europe, and the American Christians were supporting the communists to destroy Christian Germany,
right,
and so forth.
Right. You know, another irony too that's that may be worth remembering is at the end of the Second World War, millions of ethnic Germans were forcibly expelled and removed from large parts of Eastern Europe.
And the result, like 12 million.
What's that?
Like 12 million were pushed out from the Sudetenland as well as
million were either fled or were expelled. And what the result of that was, and the idea behind that was to create, especially in the case of Poland, ethnically unified, cohesive societies. And so the Germans were expelled from the territory that became the Polish Republic or the Polish People's Republic, because it was felt that the differences or the frictions between Germans and Poles were so great that Germans and Poles should not live in the same society. And now, here 70 years later, we're told that, and the leaders of Sweden and Germany and the United States and so forth say that Poland should now accept unlimited numbers of people, not from Germany, but from Syria or Ethiopia or Afghanistan. This is really madness. And of course, many Poles understandably say, well, if it was difficult for us to have a orderly and successful society with a German minority, how in the heaven's name can we expect to have a good society with unlimited numbers of people from the Middle East or Africa or Asia, for heaven's sakes? But this is typical of the lack of clarity, the lack of cohesion, the lack of thinking, the lack of serious, realist-based thinking by political leaders in the Allied countries at the end of the Second World War, and by the political leadership of the United States and Europe today.
Yes.
You know, another consequence, too, of all of this that I think is very important to remember is that in the society that we have and that prevails in Europe today and in the United States, is that leaders can push and introduce policies with catastrophic consequences, but with no accountability. They can be completely wrong. They can screw up things. They can create great calamity, but they're never held accountable. We see this over and over again. I mean, one obvious example, and one that many people have pointed out, is that George Bush and Tony Blair pushed for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 with enormous promises about what was going to happen, and on the basis of claims that were not true. And of course,
weapons of mass destruction.
Mass destruction. And yet, in spite of the horrible consequences of their policy, none of those men and those people and the other people who pushed for it were ever held accountable. This is the 50th anniversary of the landmark 1965 immigration law in the United States.
That's
and the people that pushed for that, the people that pushed for that law in 1965 made solemn promises that this would not mean any real change. It was all kind of a symbolic thing. Well, the result was very, very different. The result was to lead to drastic demographic transformation in the United States, contrary to the promises they made. But nobody's ever held accountable. Nobody's held accountable. And the same thing is now happening in Europe, that political leaders like Merkel or leaders in Sweden or France or so forth are pushing for policies that they'll never be held accountable for.
Can I ask a question about the 1965 immigration change? I think it also happened in Europe and Canada, but specifically in the United States, this was under President Lyndon Johnson. And Teddy Kennedy was one who produced this legislation. I wonder, do you think Edward Kennedy was actually being manipulated? Like, he thought he was doing the right thing. Do you think he was being manipulated from above by Johnson and the forces, or the Jewish forces behind Johnson, to implement this big change?
You know, when people ask that question, or a similar version of that question about other U.S. policy with Iraq and so forth, it goes to the question of what do people really think? What is their real motive? And I try to avoid those questions because as individuals, we often do not know very well even our own motives of why we do things. We often do things, especially when we're young, we rationalize whatever it is we want to do anyway. And so in a way, it doesn't matter. I tend to think that the leaders of the United States back in 1965 or today, or in Europe today, really believe the things that they're saying, or they half believe them, they sort of believe them.
Yeah.
In any case, what they think, I believe, is that the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is to accept an ideology and a worldview that is considered just bad and wrong and evil in our society. And so they all go along. They go along with it.
Yeah.
And, well, however, increasingly, though, I think our politicians barely believe the things they say. And one of the, I mean, when Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or Jeb Bush say the kind of things they say, I don't know if they even believe it themselves exactly. They feel like they've got to say those things.
It's like a script, you know. I mean, they're being controlled, don't you think?
No, I think they don't know what else to say. They sort of have to say it. Well, I'll put it another way. The last American president who talked in these very flowery ways about America and its future, and who really believed it, I think, was Ronald Reagan. I think Ronald Reagan was appealing to many people that when he said and talked about America as this idea country and this great shining city on a hill and America's great days are ahead, I think he's probably the last American president who really believed it.
Yeah, I think Reagan believed it.
The same words are mouthed by George W. Bush or Barack Obama, but I don't think they really believe it. You know, Barack Obama.
I don't think Bill Clinton really believed it. He was so intelligent and really smooth, but I don't think he really believed it either.
Right. But in the case like Bill Clinton, he's probably a man who doesn't care much about anything except prestige and power. He's a very cynical person.
I'd agree, yeah.
He says the things that people expect him to say and that he knows he's supposed to say. But again, we live in a society of immense change right now. One of the biggest changes that's taking place in America today and in Europe is, and polls show this, is unprecedented levels of distrust in our political leaders, our mass media. We've never seen in all.
That's a good sign.
That's a good sign. Well, it's an inevitable sign. People see all around them more and more a stark contrast between the world we're told about, the world it's supposed to be by our political leaders and our media and on television. We're presented this fantasy world on television and the world we actually live in. People can sense, even very, very unsophisticated people who have no particular interest in political affairs and so forth, can see that the general direction that American society is going in is not a good one. It's not a healthy one. People sense this all around. And that's one of the reasons why it's very important that people like you and I think the Institute for Historical Review and so forth try to explain and put this all in context, because it's not enough to be unhappy with the existing way of things. It's important to understand why it's happening and where we can go from here. And above all, to reach younger people who I say must be leaders in the future if we're really to have any kind of good future.
Yes, young people. We've got to reach young people. It's good in Sweden. You had a lot of people in their 20s and 30s when you were there in April.
Right. It was very impressive. I was really impressed by the quality, the character, the bearing, you might say, of many of the young people who came to this large meeting in Stockholm, where also Kevin McDonald spoke. There were some other speakers as well. And that was impressive because I know that there's many young people, especially it's a characteristic of young people, that they care a lot about, well, getting high, getting laid, having a good time. But those people who do have a consciousness and a concern about the future, about the world beyond their own immediate lives and their own immediate pleasures, that's the people above all who are going to make a difference and the people we have to reach.
Yes. People like you and me, Mark. So we need more of us, some more young people.
Right. Well, we're doing what we can. We're trying to reach people as well as we can. And I'm very pleased, though, that especially in the recent years, we've been able through interviews, through media and so forth, to reach far, far more people than was ever possible in the past.
Yes.
I've done in the last, well, since January, I've done maybe 40 broadcast interviews with media that reaches people all around the world, large numbers of people. And I'm very pleased that the orders and the donations and the responses and email that we get from through the IHR are from people all over the world, and of course overwhelmingly still in the United States. But this is very, very important, and we try to always keep a tone with the IHR that's solid, that's not trivial, but solid and sound in its outlook and perspective.
Yeah, I think you're actually aren't you the longest running organization of your kind, like revisionist history? I mean, been going since the 1970s, the IHR.
Right, it has. Right, it's been, yeah. Of course, things are so different. I mean, it used to be, as you know, that before the internet age, people had to write a check and put it in the mail and mail it off somewhere, and they got something. But today, enormous amounts of information and material are available instantly all over the world.
This video is one of it. We're using Google Hangouts on there. It's kind of a new technology. A lot of people are unfamiliar with it, but this is a great way to reach people. It's such an honor for me to have you on my show, Mark.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I know that you're doing other things and reaching other people, but that's very good. It's really, Brian, I mean, we, in your life or our lives, we've come to a greater awareness and realization, and a lot of in our lifetime, pieces have fit together in a way that was very, very difficult to understand when I was younger and so forth.
Well, I agree.
It's now possible to see how these things fit together in a way much more easily if one wants to understand these things than used to be the case.
Yeah, I feel the internet's been a great blessing for me. I remember it was 2007, I discovered YouTube and linked me so many other things. My mind's really expanded since I was 47 years old. Now I'm 59, but I feel the internet's been a great blessing for freedom of speech and spreading information and really finding out more of the real truth, what's really going on.
Right. I mean, of course, there are some downsides to the internet too, as you well know. Yeah. It can squander a tremendous amount of time. There's a lot of nonsense, of course, on the internet. And that's why maintaining a solid, sound presence is very important to establish trustworthiness and reliability. I think credibility is very important.
Yeah, well, that's why I followed the IHR for so long, because you really do have a credibility, a long history, and you're rational, you're sane, and you back up what you say.
Oh, thank you. Well, okay, I think I think we've covered this topic pretty well. Any comments you want to make, or questions, or things you want to bring up?
I guess I'm thinking about causes, like with the immigration crisis, like the political forces behind it, like the causes. We've talked about the sort of Zionist powers and their motives. Can you say any more about the causes?
Well, it really goes into how the crisis of the West, really, that has been a grave crisis throughout the 20th century. I think to understand that is to understand the catastrophe of the First World War, which shattered all sorts of assumptions and a trajectory of Western civilization and of Europe in the First World War. Out of the ruins of that, of course, arose movements in Europe to try to make sense of everything. The enormous challenge of communism in the 20th century. But that's a subject for another time, really. Of course, the role that organized Jewry has played has been a very, very crucial one, a very important one. As you know, I've had quite a bit to say in writing and in words about that over the years. But that's also a manifestation as well as a cause. It's also a symptom as well as a cause. It's been said that every society gets the Jews it deserves. And Jews have
every society, okay.
Jews have power in our society because Americans allow them to have that kind of power.
Yeah.
Because in a society in which the emphasis is on the individual, who has a very, very strong collective sense of its own interests and its own agenda, is going to be especially effective among people who are only thinking of themselves and their own individual happiness. And so that's one of the reasons why Jewish power is so important and plays such a huge role in the United States, because Americans are, they don't have the, you might say, the antibodies to deal with it in the way that more healthy societies do.
Yeah, so you're saying they're sort of encouraging a self-indulgent life, also a life of meaninglessness in the media, like go shopping. They're sort of steering us away from a life of real meaning and purpose and real social engagement.
That's right, yes. I mean, for many Americans, culture is simply a question of entertainment. They don't see cultural life in terms of values, in terms of why we live and what our bigger purpose is. And these are very, very fundamental questions you're raising, at least by implication, because they raise these basic questions. Well, what's the meaning of our life? I mean, and I think it's obvious that people who live lives devoted only to their own individual happiness and pleasure lead lives that are, well, they end with their death. That's it.
Yeah, and also they lack a sense of community, because people want a sense of community connection, that they're with a nation or a people doing something rather than just living an individual life. People
because human beings are not just individuals. We are social beings.
Yes.
We define ourselves in large measure by our relationships with others. And that's a real crisis of the modern age, I think, because modern media and so forth has made it possible to really screw with people's heads, you might say, in a way that was not possible throughout most of human history. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mark. I want to read a quote from your talk, Looking Ahead in the Age of Darkness. Your very last line touched me, inspired me. You wrote, "It's our duty to hold fast, to not despair, and to persevere in this long twilight struggle for the dawn of a new and better age." So we're part of bringing upon a better age, so we're going to keep at it. So it's an inspiration to know you, Mark, and have you on my show, and I want you back another time. Let's do it again.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me on, and hope we'll see each other again in the future, but good luck to you.
Very good.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Bye.